But there are also still 238 hostages being held in Israel or in Gaza tonight by Hamas. So, Jonathan, where do things stand? Where are we today, Monday, October 30th, 23 days after, 22 days? I've lost track of time since the October 7th attacks.
Sure, Melissa, great to be with you. Great to be with all of you here today. Look, I think the way to start this is to say that Israel's in the middle of a tough battle with a weaker foe. Hamas is putting up, from what I understand, a good fight. I think the Israelis have so far surprised Hamas in multiple ways, in the ways that they've entered the Gaza Strip, and the way they've been fighting in the Gaza Strip, and the way that they've been avoiding some of the traps that Hamas has left for the Israelis in an attempt to try to mire them in urban combat, in underground combat, tunnel warfare, all manner of kind of tricks that Hamas wanted to be able to deploy against Israel. For now, Israel appears to be prevailing. You're not seeing a huge amount of progress in terms of mass arrests or large numbers of senior terrorists killed. I think this is going to be a slow and steady slog, from what I understand. Part of this, I think, is due to the fact that the Israelis are trying to use more agile forces. They didn't go in with 100,000 people on the ground all at once, massive columns that could be potentially susceptible to Hamas traps. It looks like they're fighting this in a way that, at least for now, appears to be smart. These things change day to day, hour to hour, in fact. So my assessment now may not hold in another hour or another day or another week. But at least for now, it does appear that the Israelis have been able to operate the way that they've wanted to. Hamas is steadily losing its grip in the Gaza Strip. And really what's amazing is that the U.S. has not put a lot of major demands on the Israelis. The big demand is the provision of humanitarian assistance, and the Israelis are acquiescing to that request. I don't think you see a lot of fights. There are interesting debates inside Israel right now about whether the Gaza population is salvageable, in the sense that it's been fed a steady diet of Hamas ideology since 2007, give or take. So 16 years straight of being fed virulent anti-Israel propaganda, violent propaganda. There is a question of kind of what the long-term effects might be on the psyche of the Gaza population. But I think we're weeks away from beginning to determine what happens to Gaza when this is all done. There is a lot of concern still being voiced about what the future of Gaza might look like. The Israelis are saying that is not the point right now. The point right now is to make sure that a massacre of 1,400 people cannot occur again on that border. That is their only goal. And again, I think the U.S. appears to be providing Israel with the ability to do that. Now, that's kind of the tactical situation on the ground. You know, Hamas is getting worn down. I think the steady bombing, and it's been relentless from the Israeli Air Force. I think it is having a psychological effect on Hamas, and I think that is contributing to, at least for now, Israel's ability to have its way on the battlefield. So, okay, now bigger picture, and I think this is where it is. So where there's good news in the South, or at least better news than one might expect. Further afield, there are real serious concerns about a regional war, something far wider than Israel would like to see, far wider than the United States would like to see, far wider than I think most of the region would like to see. So if most of the region doesn't want to see this, why is it potentially happening? The answer is Iran. Iran is coordinating a great deal of the fire that is coming into Israel from other places right now. Of course, we're talking about attacks out of Lebanon. This has been regular and ongoing. Multiple rounds of anti-tank missiles being fired at Israeli positions, attempted infiltrations, attempted rocket launches. From what we understand right now, the Israelis have done a fairly good job of keeping a kind of a perimeter north of the border to keep Hezbollah by and large out. And anytime something moves, they fire. And I think they've killed more than 100 Hezbollahis so far. Hezbollah has been, I think, trying to minimize the death count. I think it's been a lot higher than they would have wished. From what I understand, the average number of rounds fired out of Lebanon right now is 16 per day, which under normal circumstances would be war, okay, in the north. But because Israel is trying to fight a war in the south, and that's where it would like to fight now, Israel is doing everything that it can to respond kind of tit for tat for the attacks that are coming up north. They're doing the same thing, by the way, in Syria, where there have been a number of attacks against Israel, rocket launches, etc. It's an attempt to deter. It's an attempt to scare. It's an attempt to sustain the status quo. Now, I will argue that Israel probably wouldn't be able to do that were it not for the U.S. Naval assets and Marines that have been deployed to the region. That, I think, was the big surprise to the Iranians. They probably did not expect the Biden administration to deploy those assets, and I do believe that those assets are what are right now constraining Iran and a number of its other Shiite allies, militias, Hezbollah, etc. I think that is what is restraining Iran from launching something far wider. And so the big question that we all need to ask ourselves right now is whether U.S. deterrence, such as it is, and it's not perfect deterrence, because of course we're still seeing Hezbollah and Shiite militias and Iran and others continue to coordinate attacks, but they are limited. And if they can remain limited, then this operation or this phase of the operation will be a success, meaning that Israel will be able to go in and finish the job in Gaza, remove one of Iran's chess pieces from the board, so to speak. And that we're talking about Hamas here. If we're going to put it in chess terms, I'd say Hamas is sort of the value of a knight on the chessboard. It's not a high value piece, but it's not a pawn. This could be a real win for Israel in that broader war against Iran's various proxies, that ring of fire strategy that it has deployed around Israel. But the big key to that, to keeping the fighting contained in the Gaza Strip, does appear to be on the United States, and the United States has sustained multiple attacks from Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. And so we've seen the U.S. respond in kind in Syria. The Israelis are also attacking in Syria, which is a really interesting little slice of this battlefield. We have not seen the U.S. and Israel, I think, ever operating in the same jurisdiction against the same enemies. We've seen, of course, lots of coordination and training exercises and things like that, but that's been mostly in missile defense. This is operational. I am hoping that Iran sees this and understands what that potentially could mean. The U.S. is downplaying this, and the Israelis aren't saying anything, but I think it needs to be noted here that they are now deconflicting, if not coordinating openly, in the Syrian theater. And I also think that it's not just a message for Iran and its proxies. There's a message in there for some of the Gulf states that are wondering, gosh, what's in it for me if I make, some kind of normalization agreement with Israel via the United States? I think I think they're beginning to see what a proper American alliance with a proper American ally, what that looks like. And I think there is something very heartening about that. But look, the bottom line is that even with the U.S. striking various assets and trying to sort of beat back some of these non-state asymmetric players that are trying to harm American interests, there is a question of whether Iran is truly deterred, whether Iran will remain on the sidelines as they watch their asset get picked apart in the Gaza Strip. This is, in my view, the whole game for this round. In other words, if the round ends the way that everybody wants, Hezbollah is destroyed. There's a conference that looks at the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. Gazans are allowed to return to their homes where they are still standing, of course. That's a big question in and of itself. And then Israel can then sort of dust itself off and then begin to think about what the next rounds look like. I will say I would be shocked if there are not more rounds that come after this. This is the beginning. There was a time where we all talked about the campaign between the wars, right? And this was asymmetric warfare that Israel was carrying out against Iran and those proxies, trying to weaken them to forestall the eventual war that was going to come. In my view, the Shabbat HaShchora, as they call it in Israel, or I mean, and the band probably doesn't like this, but Black Sabbath. The 10/7 massacre was the opening salvo in what is now a hot war in the Middle East. I think it is safe to say that you're watching outrage pour in from all over the region. If Israel doesn't tangle with Hezbollah now, it is a matter of time before it happens. And I do think that it's quite possible we will see open hostilities between Iran and Israel at some point soon. Don't forget, there's still a nuclear program that's dangling out there. The Iranians could use all of this as a distraction. So there are a lot of twists and turns that we may yet see here, but this is the opening salvo of I think, a much broader conflict that, we've seen some people begin to refer to this as, Israel's second war of independence. It may yet be something of that magnitude. It's early days, but we're watching. Now, the one thing that I will just say is we're hearing a lot of people right now talk about the potential for a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. And there is very much a possibility of something catastrophic occurring. We are seeing a lot of people being removed from their neighborhoods, from their homes. They're being encouraged to migrate south, away from Gaza City, away from northern Gaza, where the vast majority of the Hamas infrastructure is located. It's not the only place. There are plenty of tunnels up north, but there's some tunnels down south as well. The big question really is, I think so far the pressure has been placed on Israel by, I think, a lot of Western countries, certainly the protest movements that have been, taking place here in the United States, but elsewhere around the world, Arab capitals, European capitals. And the thinking is that Israel needs to be restrained. I would argue here that it is the restraint that Israel has experienced over the last 15 years, right? I mean, think about the first Gaza rocket war was 2008, and then 2012, and then 2014, and then 2021. Each one of those rounds of conflict, Israel was constrained and restrained by the United States and by Europe. And every time Israel stood down, Hamas came back and built back better, as they say. They were building a stronger arsenal. They were gaining capabilities. They were training in Iran, as we all know. And the result was catastrophic. The result was the 10/7 massacre. So the question then becomes, are we really trying to restrain Israel again, or is it time to restrain Hamas? I've got a piece out, just came out in the Washington Examiner. I don't know if somebody from JI can post it in the chat box. But the argument in
tomorrow's newsletter.
Okay, there you go. But I think my takeaway is, why not press all of those countries that purport to be helpful because they have been hosting Hamas or being patrons of Hamas over the years? These are, of course, the duplicitous allies that I'm referring to of Qatar, Turkey, Malaysia, Kuwait. These are the countries that I think should be pressured to lean on their client to simply surrender. The moment that Hamas surrenders and they come out of their tunnels with a white flag and with their weapons laid down, that is the moment that the misery in Gaza ends. And there is a way to stop this now. That is the way. And it needs to come from the United States. It needs to come from the Europeans and any other country that is determined to try to reduce the bloodshed in the Gaza Strip. It's got to start with the patrons who have the leverage. In other words, rather than leaning on the Qataris to be the so-called fair broker of the hostage negotiations, this is insane. The Qataris, as we know, have been funding Hamas for more than a decade. They have a safe haven for Hamas in Doha, down the street from where we have our largest air base in the Middle East. This is not an arrangement that's sustainable. What we should be doing is really twisting their arms to get their client to stand down, release the hostages, come out with your hands up, and there will be no more carnage in Gaza. There will be no more destruction in Gaza. There will be no war because Hamas will have surrendered unconditionally. This, I think, would be, not a likely outcome. Certainly not at all. It doesn't look like any of the European countries or Western countries even have the will to ask these patrons to lean on their client. But I do think that if we're trying to find a faster end to this battle, it will be that way. Because right now, even though we see Israel making progress, it will be slow. They're trying to be careful. They're trying to save lives. They're trying to stay out of the line of fire. And so it'll be slow and methodical. And of course, there will be a limit to everyone's patience. But I think if you look at what Israelis are saying in their media and their statements, their speeches to the press, this is not a war that I think after the 1,400 people were slaughtered in cold blood, more than 200 people were taken hostage. I don't see the Israelis stepping down. I don't see them bending to international pressure. So I think it's time to think about other ways to end this war. I think that would be it. I think I'll stop there. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have, Melissa, or if you wanted to open up to the rest of the crew.
Great. Well, as I said, Q&A is open, so feel free to drop in questions and we will get to as many as we can later on this evening. But I want to talk a little bit more about something that you just brought up, which is the support that Hamas has enjoyed from countries in the region, aside from Iran, which I think we really got into. But I want to talk more about Qatar. I want to talk about Turkey. What sort of support are they providing? How long have they been patrons of Hamas? What other countries do we not necessarily always think about as being a player in this in this conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, Iran is the big one. It's the big key. Just back of the envelope here, probably about $250 million a year. It's way more to Hezbollah, by the way. They provide something like $800 million a year to Hezbollah, give or take. This is more than $1 billion of money that they spend on violent groups, including the Houthis and the Shiite militias and everything else. And this is where, our sanctions relief money, that's where it goes. So when you hear folks lamenting how the Iran nuclear deal and some of the things that have followed on after, how they can really contribute to malign activity in the region, that's why money is always fungible. And so that 250 million is huge. There's also the weapons that are provided, the training, the other material support. There is a huge amount that Iran is responsible for, and the Islamic Republic is yet to pay a price. I think second most important jurisdiction is probably Qatar. It's a long-standing jurisdiction for Hamas of operations. You have Khalid Meshal and Ismail Haniyeh, two of Hamas's top leaders that are based out of there. They are not alone, though. There are Hamas spokespeople and other Hamas operatives that are based there as well. It is it's an external headquarters for the terrorist organization, and it truly makes the group international, right? And we'll go through all the other nodes in a bit, but what's shocking about this is that, again, it's right down the street from our Al Udeid Combined Air Operations Center, or KAOC as it's known. But also, the Qataris are a major non-NATO ally. We've just given them that title just several months ago through the Biden administration. And really what's shocking about that, and it's not just the Hamas support, because there is, of course, that. But we also have seen Taliban support, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, people running around, financiers. It's the Wild West. It's the cantina from Star Wars. use your best analogy. It's a place where every bad actor in the world seems to have a seat at the table, and the Qataris say, "Well, we're just doing this so we can keep channels of communication open." Really, no, thank you. I know that various administrations have relied on this channel. It's been disastrous, right? Whether it was our really embarrassing and botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, or the challenge of trying to combat ISIS finance, or Hamas or Al-Qaeda finance, certainly Hamas finance. They've not been helpful in the least. And I would even argue that right now, what we're seeing with the hostage negotiations, I've heard this now from several Israeli sources, and I believe this the moment that I saw it on Friday when the Israelis started their ground operations. It was a sign that the hostage channel was failing. If anything, I have to ask whether the Qataris are part of a conspiracy that was designed to thrust Israel into this crisis and to buy time for Iran and for Hamas and for other allies. And I think we need to say that Qataris are not actively advocating for Israel. They're advocating for themselves as they're calling themselves the honest broker, trying to show America that they have value. The Israelis gave up on that. They ran out of patience. They're still, I think, using that channel to see what they can do to break break the logjam. But just note, we've seen a handful of hostages released. But now the Israelis have just released one through grit on the battlefield, and I suspect there will be more of those. And I hope that Qatar is held to account. The Qataris, by the way, in terms of money, we estimate it's like back of the envelope, of course, but it's probably about 100 to maybe 150 million per year the Qataris provide. And that's what we know. We also believe that they are sending money by way of Iran to Hamas as well for military activities. So real problematic there. From there, real briefly, the Turks, also terrible external headquarters, people with blood on their hands operating there, fundraisers, political people, and logistics people. But the real troubling one, everybody, of course, remembers the 2014 clash between Israel and Hamas. That was precipitated by a triple homicide, if you recall, the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank. The person who planned that and financed it and coordinated it was a guy by the name of Salah al-Aruri. Aruri is a top figure within the Hamas leadership structure. He was based in Istanbul at that time, and after the war was over, he got up in front of more than 1,000 people, top leaders from within the Muslim world, including the deputy prime minister of Turkey, and he announced that he was the one that had planned and was responsible for that attack, and he was given rousing applause. You get a sense here that Turkey, especially as you look at the rhetoric now and the way that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is stoking vitriol among the Turkish population, hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets the day before their national day, right, blending Islamist ideology and cheering for a terrorist organization that killed 1,400 people, and then the following day rallying people around the flag for nationalist reasons. You get a sense this is a very dangerous leader. And again, we talked about Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. Turkey's NATO. This is an insane arrangement that this continues this way. And of course, the Turks are also responsible for ISIS problems, Iran sanctions busting, and a whole host of other illicit finance challenges. So a major challenge there. And these are countries that we deal with. A couple of other jurisdictions to note. Malaysia, most people don't know this. Malaysia has had a lot of Hamas people come through and study and train for military tactics. The Mossad has taken out a number of them in the light of day, like people just coming up on a motorcycle and just shooting their target and driving off. There's been a bunch of that over the years. I think Malaysia needs to be held to account. Kuwait is a major illicit finance jurisdiction where Hamas has benefited. And then the last one that I always marvel at it, but Algeria is an interesting one for me as well. They are kind of old school Arab nationalist, anti-West, and they give full-throated support for the so-called resistance. primarily because it's just, they see Israel as anti-Palestinian or pro-Western. But these are, I think, the dirty half dozen, so to speak, of the jurisdictions that we need to watch.
Sure. Now, with Qatar, like, what do they want? What are they angling for? I think it's often said that Qatar starts fires so that they can get credit for putting them out, which feels very apt, especially in light of what's going on with the hostages. But what is Doha's endgame?
So they play arsonist and firefighter. That's their MO. Look, what people don't realize is this is a tiny country. It's like a fly speck of a country. 300,000 total people in this little tiny Gulf state. But it's got more money than they know what to do with. So what they've done is they've gone out and they've just spent huge amounts of money. By the way, I mean, they bribed their way to gaining the World Cup. Right. And that's one of the things that they've done to try to gain some prominence in the world. They buy large assets. They have a city block here in Washington, D.C. that they own with restaurants and apartments and hotels. They spend money on Capitol Hill hand over fist. They sponsor the congressional baseball game. They keep the metro open during the hockey playoffs. They have I think like a dozen white shoe law firms and lobby firms on retainer so that they're all conflicted out and that they can use them during times of emergency. And then they do all this other stuff that I mentioned in support of the various terrorist organizations. They want to have a seat at the table no matter what happens. In some cases, they help create the problem that they ultimately end up solving. They create a crisis, or they allow one of their allies to create a crisis so that they can help solve it. I believe that the Taliban return in Afghanistan is exactly one of those kinds of situations. And I believe that what they're doing right now with Hamas and the hostages is a very similar situation too. So this is a tiny country. They've kept the United States at the Al Udeid Air Base, basically to try to, it's an insurance policy for them. No one's going to attack Qatar if the base is there. My sense is that maybe it's time to get rid of the base and let the Qataris fend for themselves, because Lord knows they have truly angered all of their neighbors in the region. Now they've really got the Israelis riled up, and you can hear the way Israelis are talking about the Qataris on television right now. It's not a very friendly discussion. They're only in it right now with the Qataris to see whether they can save a few more lives. That is the end goal here for Israel, for the Qataris. I feel like there's something much bigger. They're trying to have a big name on the world stage. I got to say, if you saw, there was a Wall Street Journal piece that I think came out yesterday by the Qatari ambassador here in Washington, where he's really trying to defend himself, because you could get the sense the anger is piling up. People are furious, and really, you can make the argument here that all the countries that I mentioned, Iran, Qatar, Turkey, Malaysia, Kuwait, and Algeria, you could actually also probably put South Africa in there too, in terms of cheerleading countries for Hamas. But they've all brought us to this moment by legitimizing Hamas, by funding them, by providing them with the safe haven. They've brought us to this moment. There is no way to argue, hey, we're doing a great job for American interests. Those interests are already out the window. And aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean are the only proof that you need to see that right now the U.S. is on the precipice of a regional war that has been brought upon us by a number of malign actors who should never have been doing this in the first place.
Sure. Let's look a little bit about at Gaza, what's going on inside of Gaza. A few days ago, Daniel Hagari, who's the IDF spokesperson, held a press conference where he said that Shifa Hospital in Gaza is being used as a headquarters for Hamas. He had a very elaborate map that detailed the different parts of the hospital, the different wings that were being used for various malign reasons. Can you explain a little bit about what is going on at Shifa Hospital?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was glad that the IDF came out with this. They actually came out with it I think 2 or 3 days after a piece that I wrote in commentary, talking about this exact same issue. I like to think that I had, a major impact there, but who knows what they read. But look, the end result is this: the only major functioning hospital in the Gaza Strip is Shifa Hospital. Below that is a massive military structure that Hamas deliberately built so that it could use the hospital as a human shield to protect it from an Israeli strike. And they've been doing this now since, we've been hearing reports about this since 2006, that they've embedded themselves and they've exploited this structure for military purposes. So in various rounds of fighting with Israel, it's been revealed publicly. Major media outlets have talked about this in the past. Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, which is not exactly the most sympathetic to Israel under the average circumstances, they released information about this. Hamas has embedded themselves there during the Palestinian Civil War of 2007, and then in subsequent rounds against Israel, they've either fired rockets from that compound, or evidence has emerged that Hamas operatives are actually inside the building or under it. At the end of the day, I do believe that this is going to be one of Israel's military objectives, is to neutralize this command center that is operating beneath the ground under Shifa. My piece, I actually strongly recommend not destroying this edifice. I think it's a huge mistake if Israel does. Israel has now gotten ahead of this with, I think, credible and relevant information. I truly believe, and this is what I wrote long before I knew the Israelis were going to talk about this, but I wrote that I think that Israel needs to surround it, demand that Hamas come out with its hands up and surrender. And then if they don't, then Israel needs to go in, taking great pains to make sure that everyone in the hospital is, taken care of, that they're protected, but that Israel needs to go in and remove everything that they can from this headquarters to be able to show the world with video, with photos, with military material that is removed exactly what was going on in there, because it is a war crime. The very existence of this military command center is a war crime. In fact, much of what Hamas does underground would be considered a war crime, given that this infrastructure is designed to be defended through Israel's fear of hitting civilians. So I think this time promises to be different. The Israelis do appear to have this as an objective now. And by the way, we're not sure, but it's quite possible that in that compound, we could find people like Mohammed Deif, the head of the military operations of Hamas. We could see Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas general operations in the Gaza Strip, as well as others that Israel deems to be high-value targets. So some interesting potential military activity on the horizon.
Now, I want to take things stateside for a few minutes. Our team in New York and Washington has been reporting tirelessly about what is going on college campuses. We saw what happened at Cornell over the weekend, where Jewish students were scared to leave their dorms. We have seen for the last 10 years, Students for Justice in Palestine and affiliated groups, they don't always go by that name, but something similar. We've seen them launch campaigns of intimidation. We have seen them launch BDS campaigns seeking to push their student governments and their university administrations to enact sanctions and divest from its holdings in Israel. What is the tie-in between National SJP and Hamas?
For now, I'm going to pass on that. I will just tell you that we'll likely have information on that soon, and I promise to share it when it's out. I'll just say that we see some potential connections. We've noted them before, but yeah, stay tuned. We'll just leave it there.
Okay. That sounds good. Then we will bring it back over to Israel. So much of the fighting has been at this point contained to Gaza, in the south. You mentioned earlier that there is another front that could potentially open up on Israel's north, the border with Lebanon, which, as we know, is really controlled by Hezbollah. Is it good for Israel to keep the fight contained to the south? Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has been very open about his desire to attack in the north, to take out Hezbollah's capabilities up there. What is the right move here?
Yeah, I mean, look, Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets, so that's roughly 10 times what Hamas has, and you can see the kind of, just frightening experience this has been for Israelis with the sheer number of rockets that have fallen. It's, I think, more than 7,500 right now, maybe even more than that at last count. It almost doesn't matter when you start getting up, 1,000 here, 1,000 there, it starts to feel real, right? And so I think there's a lot of concern about what that might look like for Israel if and when the Northern Front breaks out. I would imagine that a lot more rockets get through. There's only so many Iron Dome interceptors that Israel has at its disposal. At that point, you have to start deciding what you're going to try to protect and what you're not. And that's not a fun thing for anybody to be trying to decide in the middle of a hot war. It may be that Israel has no choice in the matter. And if that is the case, then maybe it is better to go on the offensive and to gain the initiative and to be attacking relentlessly from the get-go as opposed to responding. And I think that's the contour of the debate right now, as far as I've heard it out of Israel, is that there are people who think, there's a high likelihood, this is the highest likelihood we've seen that Hezbollah will get into the action again. It's been since 2006. They feel like it's long overdue. So maybe this is the moment. And if it is, then wow, okay, Israel's has got to get on the offensive early. That, I think, is the argument from Gallant and maybe some other former national security types that are just saying, this is the big one, guys. Let's just get it all done. I do believe, though, that there could be an order of battle. And I do think that there is some value in having the US and Israel and perhaps even other actors around the world deter Iran, force it to sit there and watch Hamas get dismantled. There is a psychological element to this that I think can be very powerful if they are felt to be helpless amidst the threat of superior firepower that could ultimately do grave harm to the regime. That credible threat, containing Iran, containing Hezbollah, would be of value. Israel knocks a piece off the chessboard, and then it can, again, I think, pick itself up off the floor, because this has been a grueling battle for Israel since 10/7, and the shock, I think, of the collapse of a lot of wrong perceptions in Israel about their security concept. I think, Israel could probably use a little time to lick its wounds and think about its next steps. There is no doubt in my mind that Hezbollah will need to be tackled at some point soon. If you thought that it was ugly, what happened on 10/7, you can't even imagine what Hezbollah is potentially capable of doing. That is the lesson that Israel has learned. And that is why people are talking about preemptive strikes versus, trying to deter them and wait for another day. But they know that it's looming. It is a serious security threat long term.
Now, I know that, especially in the day-to-day, a lot of people forget that Gaza doesn't just have a border with Israel. Gaza has a border with Egypt. Where has Egypt been in all of this for the last 3 weeks?
So Israel's, I think, tried to get Egypt to open up a humanitarian channel, a humanitarian path for Gazans fleeing the conflict. You got to remember there are 2.2 million Gazans. I think many of them probably did not welcome the war. I think they are pretty tired of these conflicts. and they're enduring something that I can only imagine. The way in which Israel has been bombing Hamas targets. It's loud, it's continuous, it is, I'm sure, traumatic, and they have every right, these people, to try to get out. The problem is that look, there are a couple of problems. One is that Egypt doesn't want the potential for additional Muslim Brotherhood supporters to come into the Sinai Peninsula and perhaps elsewhere. You got to remember the Sisi regime views the Muslim Brotherhood as an enemy, just as a lot of other countries do in the region. So that's, I think, problem one. Problem two is, and I think this is this is more salient. Sisi is so pro-Palestinian. He's such a fervent supporter of the Palestinian cause that he is willing to allow thousands of Palestinians to suffer so long as they don't leave Palestinian territory. This idea that people might be removed from a Palestinian area is like, I actually believe that this is what is stoking much of the anger that we're seeing all around the world. Yes, they're afraid about loss of life, but they're truly afraid that there's going to be another piece of what they call Palestine that could be lost. And if we're to be honest, there probably will be some pieces that will be lost at the end of this. I think there will be a large demilitarized zone in northern Gaza, where Israel is clearing out things now. And even if it's not cleared permanently, the idea of reconstruction there, it's going to take a long time. It will. And so, you will have people that will not be able to live there even after the battle is over. I think there will be similarly some kind of DMZ, perhaps a mined area closer to along Israel's that long border, that long southeastern border of Gaza, I believe, and it will eat into Gazan territory. And anyway, I mean, these are things that I think we'll have to talk about later. But yeah, Egypt is digging in its heels. It doesn't want to take these refugees, and part of the problem with Egypt, and this has not been well documented until now, but the Rafah crossing is where most of the weapons have been smuggled through into Gaza to assist Hamas. And for those that don't go across the border, sort of above ground, there's a ton of tunnels that still exist below ground, and the Egyptians are fully aware of this. They turn a blind eye to it. It's a Sinai Bedouin problem. It's an economics problem. It's an ambivalence problem. It's a corruption problem. There's a lot of different reasons why this is still happening, but I think that there will likely need to be a moment where Egypt and Israel and the United States, I think there will need to be a massive overhaul in the Rafah crossing. I would be shocked if it's not internationalized or taken over by a private company that Israel agrees to, operate alongside Egypt. But there's too much that has gotten through, and it really is the primary crossing point, from what I've heard from former Israeli officials that know this space pretty well.
All right. Just a reminder, we've got the Q&A section going. We've had a few questions, and I think this is a great thing to ask you about. If you and I had been doing this Zoom a month ago, talking about the security situation in Israel and the Middle East, I would have thought we'd be talking about the West Bank. Never in my wildest imagination would I have imagined that this would be the conversation that we're having. But there is still a security situation in the West Bank. We've seen that there have been raids, that there have been arrests, that there have been clashes. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the West Bank and what we might be able to expect in the next few weeks?
Sure. Look, it's the dog that didn't bark amidst all of the other rocket attacks and things like that. We've seen a number of arrests carried out by the Israelis. I mean, it's like dozens at this point of wanted Hamas figures and operatives from other terror groups or other anti-Israel agitators. So there have been arrests that have been taking place. It's led to some clashes, Jenin in particular. And of course, we saw a stabbing in East Jerusalem today of an Israeli citizen. So you get a sense that all is not well. But it's actually in the West Bank. People have been talking a lot about the intel failure that led up to the 10/7 attack. The West Bank was pivotal, actually, in Hamas and Iran carrying out that information operation successfully. The thing that I heard from the Shin Bet and from other senior people within the Israeli security establishment over the last year, and this was it was chapter and verse, right? It was conventional wisdom. It's what I heard every time, which was that Hamas was getting tired of these painful battles that were taking place in the Gaza Strip, that this was a territory that Hamas already controlled and they didn't need to fight there any longer. And so they were exporting the violence to the Gaza Strip, or to the West Bank, rather. And so the West Bank became this scene of lots of different raids and all kinds of military activity. There were something like 1,400 different attacks that had been registered out of the West Bank since March of last year. Politically, this played well into the platforms of people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and others that really believed that it was the security of Israelis that were living over the green line, that it was those people that needed protecting more than others. And that led to the drop in personnel along the Gaza border on the morning of 10/7. That led to a very lopsided deployment that favored the West Bank. And it's actually one of the reasons why, at least according to some people I've talked to, that there was a slower response to getting down to the south to be able to handle the security crisis as it was unfolding. So that's the background. The question now is there really a threat? Is there actually something that's brewing there? And the answer is we don't know. It's quite possible that you could see some sort of intifada type situation if there is a precipitating event, something that happens in the Gaza Strip, sort of along the lines of the Ahli hospital, right, where you began to see people completely outraged about, what was perceived as an Israeli strike that led to, hundreds of casualties. That kind of thing can still happen here. And so this is why, again, when we sort of talk about the potential for a regional war, part of it is about American deterrence and about keeping Iran and Hezbollah contained. But there are the unintended consequences, the unforeseen events here that I think still have a role to play. And that's why Israel is, I think, would be very smart to move methodically. I know there are a lot of people who just want this thing to be over. They want to see Hamas crushed. They want to see, you hear people saying, well, there's no difference between the people and Hamas anyway. So, what does it matter? Let's just, turn the whole place into whatever, a wasteland. I think those people are wrong. And I think they don't truly understand, that that's not how Israel has fought wars and how it's differentiated itself from its enemies, number one. But then number two, what that could do to the West Bank. But also don't forget, there's the impact that it could have on future normalization agreements, past normalization agreements, relationships with, the uneasy peace partners like, Egypt or Jordan. There's a lot riding on this. And so, look, Israel, I think, is fortunate that so far it's been able to fight in isolation in the Gaza Strip, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be careful because of the possible knock-on ramifications in other theaters. And I don't hear that enough, quite honestly, as I track the Israeli media. There's just not a lot of discussion about the wider implications of what's going on. They are very laser focused on simply dismantling Hamas. And I think we all have to understand why after the pogrom of 10/7, but that still doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have to be careful.
We did actually get a number of questions in these last few minutes about the Abraham Accords. So very briefly, what do you think is the future of the Abraham Accords, the ones that have already been signed with Bahrain, with Morocco, with the UAE, and then the ones that Israel is hoping to sign? We know, things were moving forward with Saudi Arabia, and that has been seen by some as an impetus for why the October 7th attack happened when it did, as it did. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do believe that Iran was deliberately trying to disrupt the Saudi track. But as I've been stressing to anyone who will listen, normalization is a process, not an event. In other words, this has been going on for quite a while. The ongoing engagement between the Saudis and the Israelis spans a whole range of different domains, from security and cyber and a range of diplomatic. And so I think there will be a role for both countries to play in the aftermath of all of this. I would be thrilled, by the way, to see reconstruction, come under the auspices of the Saudis in some kind of new arrangement where they really look to turn the Gaza Strip into something livable and manageable for the region. That would be obviously a terrific outcome. But, look, short of that, even if we don't see some kind of huge deal emerge, in 6 months, I wouldn't be surprised to see it in 2 years. And that's still incredible news when you think about it, because, I mean, if you had asked me 5-6 years ago whether, normalization between these two countries was possible, I would really have to ask you what you're drinking, right? And so there's I think I'm still bullish term Saudi. But look, Israel does, getting back to my previous point, Israel has to be strong here. They need to demonstrate that they are every bit the regional power that they were before 10/7. That's important because the Saudis were attracted to Israel because of its strength. And so right now Israel looks like it's reeling a little bit. So they need to dust themselves off and pick themselves up and start to look tougher again. And Gaza is, I think, where that plays out first. But they can't be so tough and so strong that they have unintended consequences that, could make, dealing with Israel completely unpalatable in the future. So they need to keep fighting smart. And so that's what's going on the Saudi front. On the other ones, I mean, I think the UAE appears to be still fine. Maybe it wasn't quite what it was, and I'm sure the Emiratis are doing their best to kind of balance their needs and interests. Bahrain also doesn't seem to be a problem. It's holding its own. Morocco, I've seen more protests, but I think that's primarily because this is a freer country where protests can occur. The Gulf states are a little bit less free in that respect. The political expression is just not as welcome there. The ones that I'm worried about are, of course, Egypt, which we talked about. I think Egypt has a lot to answer for in terms of the tunnel crossing, and I think tensions are going to continue to rise about that humanitarian corridor that it's refusing to provide, at least up until now, except for something like 600 dual American Palestinian passport holders, but apparently Hamas is not allowing them to leave. So it's kind of a moot point. But the one that I'm really worried about more than all the other peace partners really is Jordan. The rhetoric that the Jordanians have embraced as it relates to Israel has been vitriolic. It has been toxic. This has been going on now every Ramadan for, I don't know, the last 5 Ramadans, the last 5 years. It is not how peace partners speak to each other. And I do think that this is a relationship that needs to be rebuilt at some point. But I am worried right now that the Jordanians are doing what they're doing, this kind of vitriolic rhetoric. I worry this is a sign of weakness of the kingdom. They are, they're worried about popular support as opposed to stewarding the country in the direction that it needs to be stewarded. There's economic problems, there's political problems. So I watch that country with some concern and with some criticism. And so that's one to watch.
Great. Well, we have just about run out the clock today. Jonathan, I am so grateful that you were able to join us today to shed some light on a situation that we are all following very closely. If you're not following Jonathan already on Twitter, his Twitter handle is right below his face on the screen at Schanzer. And don't forget, if you have not already, to sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff. You can do that at jewishinsider.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all in our next edition of Inside the Newsroom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Melissa.
Recording stopped.